Hello and welcome to Just One More Watch. Welcome to the review of a loaner watch that is a little bit special. I know it's going to be a bit of a treat for me and hopefully by extension a bit of a treat for some of you as well. It's a Tissot. Now there's nothing unusual in and of that. I've reviewed plenty of Tissot on the channel in the past. I think as a brand though, they have been on a real tear over the last few years. First with the Gentleman, then the PRX, then the PRX Chrono, and now this, the 1938 Telemeter reissue. I say reissue because it's a visual facsimile of a vintage Tissot from 1938, but at about 120%. It has puffed up a bit from what was then a large 37 to what is now a more moderate 42mm in diameter. As I said, this is on loan to the channel from a Sydney subscriber called Reuven. When this watch was announced last year, I posted about it on Instagram, and when he bought the watch a couple of weeks ago, he remembered that post and got in touch with me, offering me it for review. Thank you so much, Reuven. Please do me a favour, give the man a follow on Instagram. He has a lovely collection, beard and bezel, which seems appropriate. I'll leave a link in the description of the video. We met and had a chat the other day. It is always so nice to hear other people's stories. Why did Reuven buy this one? What did he have to sacrifice to fund it? What watch got the chop to buy the Tissot? Let's flip the camera and find out. Okay, let's get this beauty out of its box and then go into its backstory. Tissot are fond of telling us that their backstory goes all the way back to 1853. They flipped a few pages backwards in their catalogue collection to the late 70s for the PRX. They flipped a few pages backwards further still, all the way back to the 30s for this one. Now this is a Swiss-made auto chrono from the Swatch Group. You're looking at just under 2,000 USD or equivalent in your local currency for one of these, RRP, but you should be able to pick up a bit of a deal on it, I'm sure. If you're prepared to go grey market, JOMASHOP has these for under $13.50. I'll leave a link in the description. Just remember, Joma then covers the warranty and not Tissot. And do you see what I see? That's the big box. That's the old box. No pop-up factory. It's the one with the hidden compartments and the built-in books. Reuven bought this directly from Tissot here in Australia. I'm not sure if that's the reason why he got the older big box or because it's a higher value item. Anyway, look at that thing. He went for the black and gold version, and I totally understand why. It's gorgeous. So what's the history behind this particular model then? Well, Tissot, as you know, have been making watches since 1853. It's nice to see they were banging on about that back in 1938. They started out making pocket watches before moving on to wristwatch style. Apparently they were then the official timekeepers of a skiing race in 1938. And if some posh Swiss people sliding down a frozen hillside isn't enough reason to launch a reissue, then I don't know what is. And this is the watch they relaunched. Looks pretty close to the original, doesn't it? Obviously that one was a mono pusher, this one has two pushers, but they stayed really faithful to the vintage watch stylistically, if not in terms of sizing as discussed. I particularly appreciate the fact that they have used the vintage style brand logo on the dial and on the butterfly clasp you'll see later on. So why did Reuven buy this one then? Well, apart from the obvious visual appeal, his grandfather, who passed away relatively recently, was a collector of Tissot. So there's a really nice story there for him continuing that family tradition by buying something from their contemporary range. And if you catch this one at the right angle, it's pretty stunning, I think. Those gold numerals and gold batons just glint perfectly. So dimensions on this one are as follows. I already told you the diameter, 42mm. Thickness is 14.2mm. Lug to lug, I measure at 50.2mm, and it has 22mm lug width. Lots of twos today. On the supplied leather strap, it weighs in at 102 grams. Case finish is simple but very well done. All surfaces are beautifully smooth to the touch, all transitions perfectly executed. It's an elegant if girthy side profile too, with a big piece of double dome sapphire and a noticeable bowl to the case back to accommodate the movement. Pushers are oval, as was the style, as you saw from those catalogue shots, and the crown is surprisingly slim. Not small, it's still a decent diameter, but just not jutting out and thereby adding extra unnecessary bulk to the profile of the watch. The supplied leather strap is perfectly decent. It smells good, you'll have to take my word for that, and the colour really complements the black and gold, I think. It's padded down the middle and with some really nice stitching on either side, and the padding peters out as you get closer to the butterfly clasp. It tapers from 22 down to 20 as well, which is nice, and as mentioned, it's the retro logo etched into the butterfly clasp mechanism. On to the movement then. Tissot are part of the Swatch Group. The Swatch Group owns ETA, the movement manufacturer. That means Tissot has access to ETA movements and to Valjoux movements. This is a caliber A05.231 based on the Valjoux 7753 but with some upgrades. Power reserve has been beefed up to 68 hours and it has been fitted with the Nivachron anti-magnetic hairspring. It has also been decorated up the wazoo, perlage everywhere, and I like the skeletonized custom rotor to finish it off. 29 joule, hacking and hand winding, and they managed to pump up the power reserve without dropping the beat rate. This is still 28.8, i.e. 4 Hz. But it does have one quirk all the old Valjoux 7750 derived movements have, and that is unidirectional winding and a rotor that spins freely. As you can see here, let's come back to that a little later on and see how it's doing. But for now, let's have a look at the dial and hands. As I said, I think this one looks best on an oblique angle when the light just catches those little applied numerals perfectly. But it doesn't look too bad most of the rest of the time as well, to be honest. The numerals are applied, but everything else is just printed on, and it's just gold on black, no other colours feature here, because no other colours are necessary here. The sub-dial at the 9 o'clock is the second hand, the sub-dial at the 3 o'clock is a 30-minute chrono timer. This watch has both tachymeter markings and telemeter markings, neither of which you are likely to use, but both of which are true to the original watch from the 1930s. The telemeter scale is on the dial's perimeter. The practical application of these in the first half of the 20th century was to measure the distance of opposing artillery forces if one could both see and hear the flashes of the guns. There's a minute track sitting just inside the telemeter scale. Both recessed subdials feature concentric circles, and I learned a new word today. This apparently is called azurage. That's quite a pleasant word. I think I'll use it again. Everything is, as you would expect, beautifully done. Crisply printed, no dust, no fluff. Any fluff you see here is on the outside of the glass, not the inside, I assure you. The stick hands are very simple, but because they're high polished gold, still reasonably legible. But you know, this one is about style and not necessarily about practicality anyway. And it certainly looks stylish on my 7-inch wrist, does it not? 42.50 and over 14 thick though, you certainly know you're wearing it. If your wrists are much smaller than mine or you're just size sensitive when it comes to your watches, I would definitely recommend that you try this one on in a shop before making any purchase, because it does have more heft to it than those vintage looks would suggest that it should. It's not unwieldy though. This strap is clearly pretty box fresh. I'm sure it will soften up with time and a little bit of man sweat, which I will leave Reuven to apply. The pocket shot to finish then to give a different perspective. There seems to be plenty of anti-reflective undercoating on the crystal, meaning you get a good clear view of the dial under most circumstances as well, which is nice. Moans and niggles then. Well, let's return to that movement with its spinning rotor. There it is, and indeed, it's still spinning. It's an old school chronograph, this one, with origins back to the 1970s. You can both feel and occasionally hear it in operation. Whether you find that charming or irritating is up to you. Likewise, 30 meters of water resistance could be a charm or an irritation depending on your perspective. You know, retro chronos aren't really sports watches, and 30 meters is exactly the same as both the Omega Speedmaster and the Breitling Navitimer. Talking of which, here it is next to my Breitling Navitimer. Now the Navi's a 43 that wears quite compactly. The Tissot's a 42 that also wears quite compactly, but it is fairly thick and chunky on wrist. The side profile shows only smooth curves, but it is pushing north of 14 because of that Valjoux base movement. The movement is 8mm thick on its own. Once you add a case, crystal, dial, hands, etc, you can see how you quickly end up at 14 plus. I wonder what this watch would have looked like and worn like if they had put it in a smaller case and gone for an ETA 2893 instead. But there's one thing I haven't told you, isn't there? What did Reuven sell to fund his purchase? Well, he sold his Hamilton Intramatic. He had a white dialed auto version of this one, but decided to chop it in against the Telemeter. I can understand why he did it given his familial connection to the brand, but the watches really are siblings anyway, aren't they? Both brands from within the Swatch Group, both watches essentially featuring different versions of the same movement. There is a difference in size though. The Hamilton is slightly narrower at 40, but ironically slightly thicker, so you win some, you lose some there, I guess. But if you're okay with this size, or indeed you are looking for this size, the Telemeter is a beautiful watch from a great brand featuring a legendary movement and with its own story to tell. And isn't that a big part of why we buy these things in the first place? because of the stories that they tell. So there you have it. Vintage looks but modern sizing. Perhaps a little too modern for me. I would have loved to have seen them release this something closer to the original size, but to be honest, if they had done that and stuck to the value, it would have worn like an egg. And it wears pretty reasonable for a 42, all things considered. Thank you again, Reuven. Your generosity is much appreciated. If you're keen to see more of the brand but at around the $500 mark, check out my reviews of the Gentleman and the PRX. Thanks for watching. I hope to see you all again in a future video.